Time is a very difficult thing to pin down. Time is money, we say. I don't have enough time. Time flies. Time drags. We think of time as a one-way motion from the past, through the present, and on into the future.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The cameras you see before you are color cameras. They are now transmitting a black and white picture. By pressing this button, which I now do, the cameras are transmitting a live color picture.
And that carries along with it another impression, which is to say that life moves from the past to the future in such a way that what happens now and what will happen is always the result of what has happened in the past. In other words, we seem to be driven along.
I know what you're wondering. What in the world is he wearing today? Are those jeans that he has on? Yes, they are. Are those green sneakers? That's ridiculous. Look at those things. And the socks? That doesn't even match. And a t-shirt, a ribbon t-shirt. What in the wide world of sports is going on here? And I realize that there are some of you who are uncomfortable with how I am dressed today because you just think it looks terrible. You think it looks ridiculous. You may be thinking what my daughters would think, that I'm just trying too hard. That, Dad, no, that doesn't work. Don't wear that, please. Stop. Don't go out in public dressed like that. It just doesn't work. I'm sure there are others of you here who are saying, oh, I am so uncomfortable with that because it's so disrespectful. He's the pastor of our church. And this is a sacred time, so he should set an example of how to dress respectfully. And sneakers and jeans and t-shirts in church just don't feel right. I mean, maybe they're okay for some, but not for the pastor of the church. And I know that there is at least one person here who is uncomfortable with the way that I am dressed because you didn't see it coming, because it was unexpected. It's not what you anticipated, because in general, you are uncomfortable with change. When things are different than what you had looked forward to, or different from what you were used to, change makes you uncomfortable. Change is a funny thing, isn't it? I mean, there are times when change is something we embrace. We're glad that some things change, when things get better, when things improve, when we have new opportunities, we celebrate change. But there are other times when change is harsh, it is unwanted, it is unwelcome, when change is forced upon us, when we move from bad to worse. There's one thing that we know will absolutely never change. And that is that things will always change. And while we may not be able to control the changes that happen around us, while we may not be able to slow down the rapidly changing world that we live in, there is one thing that we must learn to control. And that is our perspective, our attitude, our point of view on how we will behave in times of change. I want to enter into a conversation about change, how difficult change is, how amazing change is, and how we can embrace living in a changing world. But in order to kind of consider some points of view, some wisdom about how to handle change, I want to reach back in history thousands of years to the writing of a man who was identified at that time to be the wisest man who ever lived. He wrote a memoir at the end of his life as if to say, here are the things that I, the wisest man in the world, have learned, and I'm passing them on to you. And so we're going to be looking at the words of King Solomon, in the book that he left us, the book of wisdom called Ecclesiastes. And we're going to be looking at a very familiar passage. You just heard it read and heard it sung. It goes like this. There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones and a time to gather them. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to search, a time to give up. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to mend. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time for love and a time for hate. A time for war and a time for peace. Before we talk about this, would you pray with me? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, and that you would use your word spoken by your servant and anointed by your Spirit to show us a way to embrace the changing world that we live in, to have attitudes that are filled with trust and faithfulness, even when the changes around us are uncomfortable and unwelcome. Pray this for myself and for my family and for all of us here. For I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 2. There is a time for everything, a time for every season under heaven. There is a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to harvest. Now we're going to take a moment here and we're going to get theological for a minute. So if you were up late last night and you need a nap, now is the time to take it. This is the time to smoke them if you got them. If you need to put your feet up and just catch a little bit of rest in your busy day, now is the time, because we're going to go into some kind of deep Hebrew theology. Because right here behind me is Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 2. I realize many of you are going, oh, of course, that's what that is. But as you observe it, you don't have to know the Hebrew language to see that some things are very similar. You'll notice that these 4 words are exactly the same. They are the Hebrew word eight, the word for time. If you are paying close attention, you'll notice that there is a small slash before these 2 words. That is the Hebrew conjunction and. It is a time and a time, a time and a time. If you're really paying close attention, you'll notice that the letter Lamed is repeated 4 times at the beginning of the next 4 words. This is what is added as a prefix in the Hebrew language to indicate the infinitive case. A time to be born, a time to die. And so now you know some basic Hebrew. But the thing that I want you to notice about Ecclesiastes chapter 3 is that it features one of the most beautiful parts of the Hebrew language, and that is parallelism, poetic parallelism. The Hebrew language is a beautiful, poetic language. It's an Eastern language that uses a lot of imagery and metaphor, and the poetry is constructed in ways so that stanzas and colons serve to help you understand and emphasize and learn from each other. There are 5 types of parallelism in the Hebrew language. The first one is synonymous parallelism. I don't think I need to explain what synonymous parallelism is. It's when one verse repeats the same idea as the next. The first colon repeats the same as the second colon. The next kind is antithetical. Antithetical. I think so. No, there's an E in there somewhere. You understand what antithetical is. The one colon is the opposite of the first. The first is the opposite of the second, or the second is the opposite of the first. The third kind is synthetic. And that basically means that the second colon builds on the thought from the first colon. So it kind of builds a thought or an idea. It's kind of like a free-form flowing poetry. The fourth kind is climactic. If you read through the book of Psalms, you see a lot of climactic poetry. It's where a phrase is repeated over and over again. It's leading you to the climax, to the conclusion that the poet wants you to notice. And the fifth kind is emblematic. Emblematic parallelism, is parallelism that uses a simile or a metaphor, like or as. Something is like this or as this. Now, most Hebrew scholars believe that Ecclesiastes 3 is one of the finest examples of antithetic parallelism, because obviously it's words that are opposites: birth, death, planting, harvest. I want to suggest a different interpretation. That what is going on in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 is not a parallelism between the first and the second part of each colon, but a parallelism between a pair of pairs. In other words, I think the best way to understand Ecclesiastes chapter 3 is that birth is to planting as death is to harvest. We learn about the seasons when dramatic change takes place in our life, when there is great gain or great loss, when we are at a point in our life where it seems that everything is new and we are birthing new relationships and new experiences and new life, that everything seems to be ahead of us, is also a time when everything seems to be behind us. A time of great gain and a time of great loss. And that birth is to planting as death is to harvesting. Birth and planting go together. I think we can understand how birth is to planting because birth is the newness, the anticipation, the expectation, and so is planting. When planting begins a new season, and it's a season of opportunity, a season of expectation, a season of anticipation. And that is what birth is. It's a new life, a new beginning, a new career, a new relationship. But I understand planting differently because I grew up on my grandfather's farm. And what I learned about a season of planting is that it's hard work. That planting is not simply about sticking a seed in the ground. Planting is about all of the preparation that goes on beforehand. That a season of planting is not just a season of anticipation, it's a season of preparation. One of my favorite stories, and I tell it here probably too often, is the story of my grandfather's honey wagon. When I was 6 or 7 years old, my grandfather told me one night in the late winter, early spring, that the next day he was going to wake me up early and I was going to go out with him on the honey wagon. Now, I thought this was a marvelous thing, that I was going to ride on the honey wagon. I just pictured a trailer like filled with honey. How good would this be? It would be amazing. I didn't even know we kept bees on the farm. But what I found out the next morning was that when we walked back behind the barn to the tractor shed, tucked back in the corner, and somehow I had never seen it, was an old green wagon, and it was a John Deere manure spreader. And it had been used many seasons to the point where the manure had hardened and crusted all around the wagon. It kind of looked like French onion soup, but not nearly as delicious. And I remember getting it out, and my grandfather says, "This is the honey wagon." Now, the particular honey wagon, the vintage that my grandfather had, it was an analog version. It was a chain-driven spreader of manure. As the wagon was dragged behind the tractor, a chain from the wheels would move, sort of a chain that had bars in it that would push the manure to the back of the wagon. But it didn't just push it off in a very gentle, flowing fashion. At the very back of the wagon were like tines, like rakes that were spinning, so that the manure would be pushed into the tines and then it would go flying up into the air and be spread out all over the field. Well, as we were loading up the honey wagon with the supply of honey that we had accumulated in the barn through the winter, my grandfather informed me that the pusher bar was not functioning and that I was going to function as the pusher bar. So as dawn broke, we went out into what would be our cornfield, and I was, at my grandfather's instruction, pushing with a shovel and a rake the manure back into the spinning blades. I was, as you might say, in a honey storm. You can add the correct word. As golf ball and softball and giant size globs of flying manure landed on me. A very unpleasant experience, to be sure. But it was months later, as we were sitting around the dinner table after we had harvested the corn from that field, and I was eating my grandfather's Pennsylvania white sweet corn. Have you ever had that? Like the real thing. It's like vegetable candy. And I could mow down a dozen ears of that white sweet corn easily, even at 6 or 7 years old. And my grandfather looked at me and he says, "Is the corn good, Dave?" And I said, "Yeah, Grandpa, that's great." He goes, "Well, remember this, Dave. The deeper the honey, the sweeter the corn." Which I went, But it's all about preparation. A time of birth it's a time of preparation. Have you ever had a pregnant wife who had a nesting urge and started repainting your entire house? Who started preparing a crib like 6 months before the birth of your child? That's why you have premarital classes. That's why you have prenatal classes. Have you ever painted anything? I learned as a young boy, my father had me paint a fence, and I was just out there painting, and he said, "Dave, you can't just paint the fence, because you can't paint over dirt. You have to prepare the fence." And what I've learned over the years is the painting part is easy. It's the preparation part that takes the work. When we find ourselves in that season of expectation, that season of anticipation, that season of excitement for something new, don't forget to prepare. Every successful person that I have ever met, every highly successful person I have ever met, is a person who plans for the future, who plans for contingencies, who plans their steps intentionally. This is how birth and planting are connected. We learn about times of anticipation, times when everything is in front of us. We handle it better when we are prepared. But it's the second pair that really is difficult, because it's as death is to harvesting. And the words in the Hebrew are very graphic. It's not a single word. You'll notice that it's 2 words, and it literally says there is a time to uproot that which you have planted. This is the same word here, planting. This is to plant, and this is that which has been planted. And the word for uprooting literally means to cut off from the ground or to pull out of the ground. It's a violent image, it's a harsh image. And if you've ever worked on a farm, if you've ever picked a vegetable or picked a fruit, a couple of weeks ago I was in North Carolina with my youngest daughter, and she had never seen a real cotton field. And the cotton fields were ripe, and we pulled off the road into a cotton field and began to pick bowls of cotton off of the stems. You realize how hard that work is? How tedious and monotonous, and it was usually at the end of the summer in the heat of the day. I've dug potatoes, and it is the most excruciatingly difficult work I've ever done, on your hands and knees, digging out by hand the root vegetables. And if you have acres of it, it seems endless. And I think that reflects some of the pain that is associated with the loss that comes with death, because it's real. And the grief and the loss in death is substantial. And I think it says that death is to harvest as death is to reaping or uprooting that which you have planted. It was Thursday, January 21st, 1993, that I got a phone call from the headmaster of the school where my wife was a teacher, All three of our students were enrolled there, and I got a call that day. And if you've ever been a part of a private school, you realize that if you're in a private school, especially if one of you works at that private school, it becomes a very incestuous community. Everybody knows everybody, and that's a good thing because everybody looks out for everybody. And particularly in our experience in a private Christian school in Dallas, that circle of friends overlapped between church and neighborhoods, sporting activities, watching your children grow up. So the families became very, very close. Even in a school of 12 to 1,500 students, it felt like a small town. And when the headmaster called me that Thursday, he was a friend of ours, he was a member of our church, he told me about an accident that had happened that very afternoon. An 8-year-old girl, her name was Amanda, was riding home with her father. She was sitting in the back seat of their car. They came to a stoplight at a corner in Plano, and she asked her father if she could unbuckle her seatbelt to reach across the car to get something on the other side. They were stopped at a stoplight. When just at the moment she stood up to reach across the car, they were violently rear-ended, and she was thrown against the windshield and killed. Can you imagine anything more horrible? Well, the headmaster was calling me, and he was asking me to come the next day on Friday to address the elementary school students and their parents. What would you say if tomorrow you were asked to stand up in front of 400 students and many of their parents and the teachers that knew and loved this family? What would you say? I can promise you I had no idea what to say until God told me what to say. It was one of the rare times in my life when I knew exactly what I should say, and I knew it almost instantly. I wrote a story that I read to the students that Friday. In fact, I have never read this publicly since that day in 1993. The little girl who was killed was named Amanda. And God gave me a story that I called Amber's Garden. And this is that story. There once was a garden showered with light, filled with beautiful flowers, lovely and bright. Daisies and dandelions, begonias and baby's breath, carnations and chrysanthemums, violets and tulips, snapdragons and sunflowers, and most of all, roses. Yellow, pink, white, dark, and light. In the middle of the garden, in the middle of the roses, 2 roses grew together. One named Amber, the other named Heather. Amber and Heather knew all the others. They knew the names of all of the flowers. The sunflowers, Lars and Bjorn, were big and strong. They followed the sun all day long. The pansies and the baby's breath were always complaining. It didn't matter if the sun was shining or if it was raining. The violets were purple and proud. The daffodils were yellow and loud. The daisies were always having fun. The carnations just chilled and soaked up the sun. Heather and Amber knew them all, each one unique, small or tall. Then one day some new flowers grew, not like the others. These were mean and rude. They were nasty and cruel and said mean stuff. They popped up all over, and they really were rough. All of the flowers were really scared. These so-called weeds, they were everywhere. Were weeds and were mean, they started to shout. Just then the gardener stepped in and started pulling them out. He threw them in a bucket, big and black. He yanked them right out of the ground. They weren't coming back. Heather and Amber cheered for the gardener. All the flowers loved the good gardener. After a storm, he cared for his flowers. When the soil grew hard, he would till it for hours. Broken in storms or faded by heat, he lifted them up when the flowers grew weak. Then one day he came with a basket of blue. As he went through the garden, Heather and Amber had no idea what he was about to do. He began filling his basket with all of their friends. He pulled out their roots and cut off their stems. Then the gardener reached for the roses. Heather did not understand. No, she shouted as he reached out his hand. His hand reached for Amber and he took her away. Why? Heather screamed. The gardener didn't say. When the gardener came back, everything had changed. Black bucket or blue basket, it didn't matter. It wasn't the same. I don't understand, Heather would say every time the gardener came by her way. Heather never forgot the daffodils that were so loud, the giant sunflowers that were so proud, the violets that were so shy or amber made her cry. As the lonely days passed, the winds blew harder, the weeds seemed meaner, the rains turned colder, and Heather grew older. Then one day, his hand was on Heather's stem. He placed her in the basket where Amber had been. On the gardener's hands were scars and dirt, but once in his hands, Heather didn't hurt. In the gardener's hands, Heather heard him say, "Don't be afraid. I'm taking you home today." The home of the gardener was shiny and bright. It stood above the garden, filling it with light. Inside his home was a room filled with flowers, none of them broken, all standing tall, not one of them weak. Heather recognized them all. Violets smiling, pansies laughing, baby's breath giggling, daffodils singing, carnations just chilling, sunflowers standing. "Hello, Heather," Lars gave a shout. "Isn't this great?" Bjorn called out. Here in the gardener's home, they all looked together. They looked so alive. They never looked better, and no weeds ever. Where is Amber? Heather thought to herself. She has to be here, in that vase, on that shelf. Then Heather was placed in that vase on that shelf with Amber beside her, better than new. "Welcome home," Amber whispered. "I've been waiting for you." And they lived there together, Amber and Heather, with all their friends alive better than ever, in the home of the good gardener, happily forever after. Now, I don't know if that helped a single student that day. Because the hardest thing about change that is forced on us, the change that comes with death, the pain of it, is in most cases we make no choice. It is unwelcome and unwanted, and all we want is one more day, one more hug, one more chance. And this is when it uproots that. It uproots it. It uproots that which we had given birth to. It uproots that which we have nurtured. It uproots the seeds we have planted. When the end of a season comes, there is certainly suffering. But there is also gathering. A gathering of memories, a gathering of remembrances, a gathering of families, a gathering of hope. I remember in the fall, every year, my grandmother's kitchen turned into a factory. The kitchen table was lined with hundreds of mason jars, and every day she would be busy on the stove preparing pickles and carrots and corn and succotash, which I never liked or really understood where the name came from. But there were jars and jars and jars of the fruit, of the harvest, of the things that we had grown that came from our garden. And they were placed in mason jars, and then we would carry them down into the cellar and filled the shelves. And for the coming winter, for the coming days ahead, that fed us. The things that we remember, the things that had grown, the things that we harvested, the things that got pulled up by the roots, fed us. I remember my grandfather would take a portion of the corn that we had harvested, and he would put it in a corn crib. Corn crib was a large mesh sort of holding room. And in that corn crib, the corn would dry. And the next spring, we would pull the kernels off of the cobs and feed the cobs to the cows and take the kernels back out and plant them in the ground. And the seeds would grow into corn that would feed us in the coming years. So you see, death is to planting, or death is to harvest in a way that it's not just a time of suffering, it's a time of gathering. Gathering our thanks, gathering our remembrances, gathering the reminders, gathering the seeds and the fruit of the times that we had, of the memories that we had. Does that eliminate the pain? Absolutely not. But does it give us something to hold on to? Does it give us something that reminds us and feeds us and cares for us in a season of great loss? Absolutely. You see, I think these pairs of pears teach us something. They teach us that birth is to planting as death is to harvest. That in times of great anticipation, of expectation, of opportunity, we should be prepared. The challenge is preparation. But in times of great loss, in times of suffering, in times of sorrow, in times of death, we should look at it as a season of gathering. Gathering our remembrances, gathering the fruit of the time that we had in that season. Now, I am not a Hebrew scholar. I was not the worst Hebrew scholar ever. I remember my professor, my final semester in seminary, was Dr. Kenneth Barker, and he was a Harvard-trained Semitic language expert. He was the chairman of the Old Testament Translation Committee for the New International Version. This was a very bright and profoundly boring man. And I remember in that last semester, I was underwater. We were trying to have a child, and I was working 2 jobs, and I missed an assignment. And we got to the weeks before the end of the semester, and I was supposed to flunk the class. And it may have been because I was a lousy Hebrew student, but it also was technically because I forgot an assignment. And I remember his teaching assistant, his graduate assistant, pulled me aside, and he said, you missed an assignment and it's too late to turn it in, and technically you should flunk. But Dr. Barker is willing to allow you to pass the class because of the levity that you brought to the class. Levity in Dr. Barker's Hebrew class was, hey, look at that weather. He thought that was hilarious. And because of that, so I may not be the best Hebrew student, but I am technically the most hilarious Hebrew student. And I'm sure that Dr. Barker is cursing my name if he knew that I was contradicting thousands of years of Hebrew scholarship and suggesting to you that intentionally we should understand the parallelism of Ecclesiastes chapter 3 as not antithetical parallelism, but synonymous parallelism. I'm going against literally thousands of years of Hebrew scholarship, except I have a hunch. If you look at your Bible and you see how the chapters are divided, you'll notice that at some point there were a group of Hebrew scholars who determined that not 2 words should be 1 verse, but 4. That it really was pairs of pairs. And they were meant to teach us how to cope with change, how to deal with the difficulty of change, because Ecclesiastes chapter 3 is a textbook on trusting God in changing times. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 in verse 9 says, "What do workers gain from their toil? I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. I know there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing take it from it. God does it so that his people will trust him." Over the next 7 weeks, we're going to be experimenting with change. I'm going to wear 7 pairs of sneakers and 7 pairs of blue jeans. I'm going to be making you uncomfortable with the way I am dressed, but we're not going to stop there. We're going to experiment with changing our services. We're going to experiment with changing what is familiar. We are going to create an environment of change, which is the world that we live in, a constantly changing environment. And the question isn't, can we control the changes that happen around us and even to us? The question is, what will be our attitude in changing times? Can we learn to embrace change? You see, because I know there is one person here who is uncomfortable with this whole idea of change, with what I am wearing, and kind of messing with the familiar of our Sunday experiences. And any kind of change makes that person uncomfortable. I know that person is here because that person is me. Why do you think I get on my knees every Sunday and pray the same thing? Because I like the familiar, I like the routine. I brush my teeth the same way, I work out the same way. I live my life trying to find that place where in a changing world it feels like a refuge. But what I haven't learned is the beauty of embracing change. And if I can do it, anybody can.